In the prestigious Fort Brennan Military Base, a new commander arrives to take charge. Lieutenant Colonel Amara Wilson, decorated intelligence officer with 27 years of distinguished service, steps into a system where discrimination thrives in the shadows. When Sergeant James Mercer confronts her without knowing her rank, his deep-seated prejudice begins to surface. What follows is a battle not fought with weapons, but with courage, strategy, and unwavering determination. As Mercer and his allies attempt to undermine her authority, Amara methodically builds her case, gathering evidence that reveals a pattern of discrimination affecting countless soldiers. Witness the systematic dismantling of an entrenched culture of prejudice as one leader stands firm against those who believe their badges make them untouchable. This is more than one woman's fight for respect. It's a mission to transform an institution and ensure justice for every person who wears the uniform. What would you do if you witnessed discrimination in your workplace? Would you have the courage to stand up like Lieutenant Colonel Wilson? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that make you think about the world we live in. Lieutenant Colonel Amara Wilson adjusted her sunglasses as she gazed up at the imposing main building of Fort Brennan Military Base. The morning Virginia sun cast long shadows across the parade grounds, where a group of soldiers performed their morning PT drills with mechanical precision. At 50, Amara still maintained the erect posture and disciplined bearing that had served her well through 27 years of military service. 27 years, she murmured to herself, and still the first day at a new post feels like basic training all over again. She'd chosen civilian clothes for today's informal tour, a tailored navy pantsuit and sensible shoes, reserving her uniform for tomorrow's official ceremony. As the incoming base commander, she wanted to observe Fort Brennan's operations in their natural state before everyone knew who she was. Amara checked her watch, 07:30 hours. Her official guide wouldn't arrive until 0800, giving her time to wander the grounds and form her own impressions. She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen to review her notes. Fort Brennan housed 3 specialized training units, intelligence operations facilities, and served as a strategic coordination center for East Coast deployments. The base had a distinguished history dating back to 1943, but recent reports suggested troubling patterns in personnel management and morale. A notification popped up on her screen, a text from her daughter Maya. "Good luck today, Mom. Call me tonight and tell me how your first day went. Love you," Amara smiled. Maya was in her second year of medical school at Johns Hopkins, following her own path of service, though in a different uniform. Pride swelled in Amara's chest. Through all the deployments, relocations, and challenges of military life, she'd managed to raise a daughter who was both brilliant and compassionate. "Excuse me, ma'am," a young corporal approached and saluted. "Are you Lieutenant Colonel Wilson?" "At ease, Corporal," Amara replied with a warm smile. "I am, but no need for formalities yet. I'm just getting the lay of the land." "Yes, ma'am, Major Daniels asked me to inform you that he's running about 15 minutes late for your tour. There's a situation at the motor pool he needs to address." "No problem at all, I'm happy exploring on my own for now." The corporal hesitated. "If you're interested, ma'am, there's a tactical response training exercise happening at Field C right now. It's actually pretty impressive to watch." "Thank you, Corporal, I think I'll do that." Following the corporal's directions, Amara made her way across the base toward the training fields. She'd reviewed Fort Brennan's training schedules during her preparation and was particularly interested in their tactical response protocols. Her own background in military intelligence had taught her that field operations often revealed more about a unit's culture than any official report. Field C was a sprawling training ground bordered by an observation platform. About 20 soldiers were engaged in a complex maneuver involving simulated building entries and hostile response scenarios. Amara found a spot on the platform alongside several other observers and watched with an analytical eye. The squad moved with discipline, but lacked some of the fluid coordination she'd seen at other installations. Their communications appeared stilted, with several moments of confused repositioning that would have been deadly in actual combat. She made mental notes for future improvements. "Their flanking protocols need work," she murmured to herself. A man's gruff voice came from behind her. "And what would you know about tactical flanking maneuvers?" Amara turned to find herself facing a stocky sergeant with close-cropped gray hair and a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face. His name tape identified him as Mercer. "I've seen a few in my time," she answered diplomatically. Sergeant Mercer looked her up and down with undisguised skepticism. "This observation deck is restricted to authorized personnel during active training exercises. Who authorized your access?" "Corporal Stevens directed me here," Amara replied calmly. "I'm waiting for Major Daniels." The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "I don't know any Corporal Stevens and I don't see any credentials on you." His tone sharpened. This is a secure military installation, not a tourist attraction. Amara recognized the building tension. She'd experienced this type of encounter before, the immediate assumption that she didn't belong, the unstated but obvious racial undertone. 27 years in uniform had taught her to navigate these waters with calm precision. "I understand your concern for security, Sergeant," she said, reaching for her ID in her purse. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from this area immediately," Mercer interrupted, his hand moving to rest on his sidearm, a clear intimidation tactic. "Civilians aren't permitted to wander around taking pictures of military training." Amara hadn't been taking photos, but the implication was clear. She maintained her composure, remembering the core principles that had guided her career: dignity over confrontation, documentation over emotion. "Sergeant Mercer, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Amara Wilson. I'm scheduled to meet with Major Daniels this morning." The sergeant's expression didn't change. "Anyone can claim military rank, ma'am. Without proper identification and escort, I'll have to ask you to leave." His emphasis on ma'am carried a distinct note of derision. Two junior officers had paused nearby, clearly noticing the interaction. Amara made mental note of their presence, potential witnesses if needed. "I understand, Sergeant. I'll connect with Major Daniels and return with proper escort." Amara's tone remained professional, but her mind was cataloging every detail of the encounter. This sergeant's behavior would be the first item in her assessment of Fort Brennan's cultural challenges. As she turned to leave, Amara glanced back at the training exercise. The squad had completed their maneuver and was regrouping for evaluation. Whatever their tactical shortcomings, she knew that within weeks they would be performing at a higher standard. Fort Brennan was her responsibility now, and from the commanding officer down to the newest recruit, she intended to elevate every aspect of its operation. Tomorrow's ceremony would be interesting indeed. Sergeant James Mercer completed his inspection of the training exercise with methodical precision, making notations on his clipboard about performance metrics and protocol violations. At 45, Mercer had spent 23 years in the Army, the last 8 as patrol supervisor at Fort Brennan. His stocky build and perpetual scowl had earned him the nickname Bulldog among the junior ranks, a moniker he privately enjoyed. "Johnson, pull your squad for debrief," he called to one of the sergeants. "That building entry was sloppy. I counted 3 potential casualties." Mercer surveyed the training field with proprietary satisfaction. Fort Brennan was his domain, at least the security and patrol aspects, and he took pride in maintaining strict order. The base had operated under Colonel Harrison's command for the past 4 years, but Harrison was a hands-off leader who delegated day-to-day operations to career NCOs like Mercer. The arrangement suited Mercer perfectly. He spotted the woman in civilian clothes again, this time walking along the perimeter road with Major Daniels. His eyes narrowed. Something about her demeanor bothered him, the way she carried herself with authority, the critical eye with which she observed the facilities. Civilians shouldn't look at military operations that way, like they were evaluating them. "Specialist Rivera," he called to a nearby soldier, "keep an eye on the training area. I need to check something." Mercer made his way toward Major Daniels and the civilian woman, his pace deliberate. As he approached, he overheard fragments of their conversation. "Intelligence facilities are scheduled for upgrade next quarter," Daniels was saying. "The allocation seems insufficient based on the operational tempo," the woman replied. "We should reassess the budget priorities." Mercer's irritation spiked. Who was this civilian to discuss military budget allocations? He intercepted them at the junction of 2 paths. "Major Daniels," Mercer said, saluting, "I need to verify authorization for civilian access to operational areas." Major Daniels looked momentarily confused. "Sergeant Mercer, this is." "I encountered this individual earlier at the tactical training observation platform," Mercer interrupted, directing his attention exclusively to Major Daniels while gesturing toward Amara as if she weren't present. She was unsupervised and observing restricted training activities. Amara studied Mercer's face with clinical detachment. His deliberate avoidance of eye contact with her, the way he referred to her in the third person while she stood right there, these were familiar tactics designed to diminish and otherize. Major Daniels cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sergeant, I was about to introduce." "With all due respect, sir," Mercer continued, "base security protocols require all civilian visitors to be properly credentialed and escorted at all times. I don't see any visitor badge." "That's because I'm not a visitor, Sergeant," Amara said calmly. Mercer finally turned to face her directly, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, Fort Brennan is an active military installation with restricted access, without proper credentials." "Sergeant," Major Daniels attempted again, discomfort evident in his voice. One moment, Major, Amara said quietly, raising her hand slightly. She faced Mercer directly. Sergeant Mercer, I understand your concern for base security. That's commendable. However, your approach requires adjustment. Mercer's jaw tightened. With respect, ma'am, military security isn't something civilians can evaluate. I agree completely, Amara replied, her voice level. Fortunately, I'm not a civilian. She reached into her purse and produced her military ID. Lieutenant Colonel Amara Wilson, United States Army. I'm touring the facility today before assuming command tomorrow morning. A flicker of something passed across Mercer's face, surprise quickly masked by skepticism. He examined her ID card with exaggerated care, turning it over as if checking for forgery. This appears to be in order, he said finally, his tone unchanged. However, standard protocol still requires proper uniform on base, Lieutenant Colonel, for security purposes. Two junior officers had slowed their pace nearby, clearly observing the interaction with interest. Specialist Teresa Ramirez and Lieutenant David Chen exchanged glances, their presence not lost on Amara. I appreciate your thorough attention to protocol, Sergeant, Amara replied. I chose civilian attire today specifically to observe base operations without altering regular behaviors. Major Daniels is my authorized escort. Mercer's posture remained rigid. I wasn't informed of any command transition. Colonel Harrison didn't mention it at yesterday's security briefing. The official announcement and ceremony are scheduled for tomorrow, Major Daniels explained, clearly uncomfortable with Mercer's continued challenging tone. Nevertheless, Mercer pressed, proper channels of notification should have been followed. Security protocols exist for a reason. Amara observed Mercer carefully, his defensive posture, the way he continued to challenge her authority despite confirmation of her identity. This wasn't simply about protocol, the sergeant was marking territory. Sergeant Mercer, she said, her voice taking on a firmer edge, I'd like you to accompany us for the remainder of the tour. Your security perspective could be valuable. The invitation, more accurately, a command, was a strategic move. Keeping Mercer close would allow her to observe his interactions and reactions firsthand. Mercer hesitated, caught between refusing a direct request from a superior officer and accepting a role in what he clearly viewed as an unwelcome transition. I have duties to attend to with the training exercise, ma'am, he replied stiffly. Surely your second can handle that, Amara responded. I'm particularly interested in your assessment of our security vulnerabilities. Major Daniels glanced between them, sensing the underlying tension. Sergeant Mercer has been instrumental in our security protocols, Colonel. His input would indeed be valuable. Mercer's hand tightened imperceptibly on his clipboard. Very well, ma'am, I'd be happy to assist. As they continued the tour, Amara noted how Mercer positioned himself slightly behind her left shoulder, a subtle positioning that would force her to turn awkwardly to address him directly. She adjusted her own stance accordingly, maintaining the power dynamic appropriate to their respective ranks. Specialist Ramirez and Lieutenant Chen followed at a discreet distance, their curiosity evident. Word would spread quickly about this interaction, Amara knew. First impressions were forming on both sides. Throughout the facility's tour, Mercer's comments were technically correct, but delivered with an undertone that suggested he was educating someone ignorant of military matters. When they reached the communications center, his explanation was particularly condescending. This is our secured communications facility, ma'am, he said, emphasizing secured as if she might not understand the concept. All transmissions follow strict encryption protocols. That means they're protected from unauthorized interception, he added unnecessarily. Thank you, Sergeant, Amara replied evenly. I'm familiar with SATCOM encryption, having designed the updated protocol implemented across CENTCOM during my last deployment. A flash of surprise crossed Major Daniels' face, while Mercer's expression hardened further. Of course, ma'am, Mercer said after a pause. I'm simply providing comprehensive information as requested. By the time they completed the circuit of the base's main facilities, Amara had compiled a mental catalog of Mercer's behaviors. His consistent undermining language, his positioning to assert dominance, his selective emphasis on regulations when speaking to her versus Major Daniels. None of it was explicitly racial or gender-based. Mercer was too experienced for such obvious missteps, but the pattern was unmistakable to someone who had navigated such waters for decades. Thank you for your input, Sergeant, Amara said as they concluded near the administration building. You're dismissed to return to your duties. Mercer stiffened slightly at the direct dismissal. Ma'am, if I may, there are several security concerns that should be addressed before any command transition. Colonel Harrison has always prioritized my briefing on these matters. I'll review your written assessment tomorrow after the ceremony, Amara replied. Please have it on my desk by 0900. Their eyes met in silent understanding. Mercer recognized the dismissal for what it was, an assertion of authority. He saluted stiffly. Yes, ma'am, 0900 tomorrow. As Mercer walked away, Major Daniels exhaled slowly. Sergeant Mercer is very committed to his role, Colonel. So I've observed, Amara replied thoughtfully. Tell me, Major, how long has he been patrol supervisor here? 8 years, ma'am. Colonel Harrison has relied heavily on his experience. And his record, Major Daniels hesitated. Technically exemplary, he's never missed a security inspection benchmark. Technically, Amara repeated, noting the careful word choice. And the base climate surveys, personnel complaints. I would need to pull those records for you, Colonel. Please do, Amara said quietly. Have them ready with Sergeant Mercer's security assessment tomorrow. As they parted ways, Amara noticed Specialist Ramirez and Lieutenant Chen still observing from a respectful distance. She nodded to them, a silent acknowledgement. The first piece of the Fort Brennan puzzle was taking shape in her mind, and Sergeant James Mercer had just revealed himself as a significant factor in the base's cultural equation. Tomorrow would indeed be illuminating. The next morning dawned with the crisp efficiency typical of military ceremony days. Amara rose at 0500 hours, completed her morning PT routine, and methodically prepared her dress uniform. Each ribbon and insignia represented milestones in her career, deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, commendations for intelligence operations that had saved countless lives, and the accumulated expertise of nearly 3 decades of service. At 0645, she received a text from Maya. Thinking of you today, Mom, you're going to be amazing. Amara smiled, drawing strength from her daughter's unwavering support. Rather than proceed directly to the ceremony preparations, Amara decided to conduct one final informal assessment of the base. Wearing her full dress uniform, she drove to the Eastern Training Sector, an area not included in yesterday's tour. According to the schedule, no exercises were planned there until 0900, giving her time to evaluate the facilities. The training sector consisted of a large field with several tactical structures, a mock urban environment for close-quarters combat training. Amara parked her car and walked along the perimeter, making mental notes about maintenance issues and potential improvements. This area is restricted, ma'am. The voice came from behind her, familiar in its authoritative tone. Sergeant Mercer approached with 2 junior MPs flanking him. His expression registered momentary recognition when he saw her uniform with its Lieutenant Colonel insignia, but he didn't alter his approach. Good morning, Sergeant Mercer, Amara replied calmly. I'm conducting a facility assessment before the ceremony. Mercer's jaw tightened. With respect, ma'am, this sector requires advanced scheduling for inspection. There are safety protocols in place. Amara noted how he positioned himself, slightly too close, an intimidation tactic she recognized from their previous encounter. I appreciate your concern for protocol, Sergeant. However, as base commander, my authority extends to all areas of Fort Brennan. The change of command hasn't occurred yet, ma'am, Mercer countered. Until the ceremony, Colonel Harrison remains in command, and his standing orders require all personnel, regardless of rank, to follow proper channels for accessing training sectors. The 2 MPs exchanged uncomfortable glances. They clearly hadn't expected to be involved in confronting a lieutenant colonel. I see, Amara said, maintaining her composure. And did Colonel Harrison specifically instruct you to monitor this area this morning? Base security is my responsibility, ma'am. I conduct regular patrols of all sectors. From the corner of her eye, Amara noticed a figure approaching Colonel Thomas Reynolds, the base operations officer. She had met him briefly during her official in processing yesterday. Is there a problem here? Reynolds asked as he approached. Just a procedural clarification, Colonel, Amara replied. Mercer turned, his posture stiffening further. Sir, I was explaining to Lieutenant Colonel Wilson that unscheduled inspections of training sectors require proper authorization. Reynolds looked between them, quickly assessing the situation. I believe the Lieutenant Colonel's authority is sufficient, Sergeant. Sir, with respect, Colonel Harrison's standing orders. No longer apply, Reynolds interrupted firmly. The command transfer paperwork was processed by division yesterday. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's authority is already in effect, regardless of this morning's ceremony. Mercer's face flushed, but before he could respond, his radio crackled with an urgent report of a security breach at the north gate. The 2 MPs looked to him expectantly. You should attend to that, Sergeant, Amara said calmly. For a moment, tension hung in the air as Mercer seemed to weigh his options. Then, with a curt yes, ma'am, he turned to leave with the MPs. As they walked away, Mercer's voice carried back clearly. Remember when officers actually earned their rank instead of getting diversity promotions? The MPs visibly tensed but continued walking. Colonel Reynolds inhaled sharply. Lieutenant Colonel, I apologize for. Amara raised her hand slightly. Did you witness that comment, Colonel Reynolds? I did. It was completely inappropriate and— Please document it, Amara interrupted calmly. I'd like a written statement from you by end of day. Reynolds nodded, understanding immediately. Of course. Tell me, Colonel, Amara continued as they walked toward the administration building, is Sergeant Mercer's behavior typical? Reynolds hesitated. Mercer is technically proficient. Colonel Harrison valued his attention to security protocols. That wasn't my question, Amara replied evenly. After a pause, Reynolds sighed. There have been incidents. Nothing officially documented. Harrison discouraged formal complaints as disruptive to unit cohesion, but Mercer has a reputation, particularly with minority personnel. I see, Amara said, and the climate surveys consistently show concerns about equal treatment, but Harrison attributed that to generational sensitivity. Amara nodded, processing this confirmation of her initial assessment. Thank you for your candor, Colonel. I believe it's time for my ceremony. The change of command ceremony proceeded with traditional military precision. The base personnel assembled in neat formations, flags were exchanged, and Colonel Harrison formally relinquished command to Lieutenant Colonel Wilson. From her position on the podium, Amara could see Sergeant Mercer standing rigidly in formation, his expression unreadable. As she delivered her brief address to the assembled troops, Amara maintained eye contact across the formation. Fort Brennan has a proud tradition of excellence, she concluded. Under my command, we will uphold that tradition while ensuring every service member is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. No exceptions, no excuses. Her gaze found Mercer briefly before scanning the entire formation. The message was clear to everyone present. Change had arrived at Fort Brennan. The morning after the change of command ceremony, Fort Brennan hummed with activity and whispered conversations. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's arrival had created a ripple effect throughout the base hierarchy, and nowhere was this more evident than in the administrative headquarters. Amara arrived at her office at precisely 0700 hours, allowing time to review personnel files before her scheduled meetings. Her new office still bore traces of Colonel Harrison's tenure, the austere furnishings and precisely arranged military memorabilia reflecting his by-the-book approach to leadership. Major Daniels waited outside, holding a stack of folders. Good morning, Colonel. I've prepared the files you requested. Thank you, Major. Please come in. Inside her office, Amara arranged the files methodically on her desk. I've reviewed the base climate surveys from the past 3 years. There's a consistent pattern of concerns regarding equal treatment, yet I see no formal investigations or corrective actions. Major Daniels shifted uncomfortably. Colonel Harrison preferred to handle such matters informally, ma'am. So I gather, Amara replied. I've also noticed 17 transfer requests from minority personnel in the past 18 months. That's significantly above average for a base this size. Before Daniels could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. Sergeant Mercer entered, a folder tucked under his arm, his uniform immaculate. 0900 hours as ordered, ma'am, my security assessment. His tone was professionally neutral, but his posture remained rigid with barely concealed tension. Thank you, Sergeant. Please wait outside while I review it. I'll have questions for you shortly. A flicker of surprise crossed Mercer's face. Clearly, he had expected to deliver his standard briefing as he had with Harrison. He hesitated briefly before nodding. Yes, ma'am. After Mercer exited, Amara opened his security assessment. The document was thorough, detailing various protocols and potential vulnerabilities with technical precision. Yet something caught her attention immediately. Major, I noticed Sergeant Mercer has included a recommendation to increase surveillance in the Eastern Barracks sector, citing behavioral concerns among junior enlisted personnel. What specific concerns is he referencing? Major Daniels hesitated. That's primarily where our minority personnel are housed, ma'am. Mercer has repeatedly suggested they require additional monitoring. Based on what evidence? There isn't any documented incident that I'm aware of, Colonel. Amara made a notation in her tablet. I see. Now, regarding yesterday's incident. The office door opened, and Colonel Reynolds entered with 2 civilians in professional attire. Colonel Wilson, excuse the interruption. These are Agents Martinez and Thompson from the Inspector General's office. They're here about an ongoing investigation. Amara rose to greet them. I wasn't informed of any IG investigation at Fort Brennan. That's part of why we're here, Colonel, Agent Martinez explained. We've been investigating a pattern of allegations across multiple installations. Fort Brennan came up repeatedly in our interviews. What kind of allegations? Amara asked, though she had already begun to form a hypothesis. Systematic discrimination, particularly targeting African American and Hispanic personnel, Thompson replied. Disproportionate disciplinary actions, biased performance evaluations, and a pattern of denied advancement opportunities. And you weren't notified because Colonel Harrison didn't forward our initial inquiry, Martinez added. That itself became part of our investigation. A soft knock at the door preceded the base legal officer, Captain Sarah Jenkins. "Colonel, I've completed the review you requested of disciplinary actions from the past 2 years." She paused, noticing the IG agents. "I can come back later." "No, please continue, Captain. Your findings may be relevant to our discussion." Jenkins opened her folder. "As you suspected, ma'am, there's a statistically significant disparity. Minority personnel receive disciplinary actions at 2.8 times the rate of white personnel for similar infractions. Sergeant Mercer's name appears as the reporting officer in 73% of these cases." The room fell silent as the implications settled. Outside the office window, Amara could see Sergeant Mercer waiting, his posture still rigid with military precision. "Agents, I believe your investigation and my own concerns may align," Amara said carefully. "I'd like to review your findings and coordinate our approach." Over the next hour, a disturbing pattern emerged as they compared notes. Fort Brennan's issues weren't isolated incidents, but part of a systematic problem that had been actively concealed by the previous command. Sergeant Mercer wasn't merely an individual with prejudices, he was a symptom of institutional failure. "Colonel Harrison appears to have deliberately shielded Mercer and others from accountability," Thompson noted. "Your predecessor rejected 3 formal EO complaints without investigation, and allowed transfer requests instead of addressing the underlying issues," Amara added, effectively removing those who might challenge the status quo. A knock at the door interrupted them. Lieutenant Chen and Specialist Ramirez, the 2 witnesses from yesterday, stood nervously at attention. "Colonel Wilson, may we speak with you?" Chen asked. "It's about Sergeant Mercer." "Come in, Lieutenant, your timing is opportune." Chen glanced at the IG agents uncertainly. "Ma'am, after yesterday's incident, several personnel approached us. They've experienced similar treatment from Sergeant Mercer but were afraid to report it. When they heard how he spoke to you, they realized they might finally be heard," Amara finished for him. Specialist Ramirez stepped forward. "There are 12 service members waiting to speak with you, ma'am. They've documented incidents going back 3 years." Amara exchanged glances with the IG agents, who nodded in understanding. "Captain Jenkins, please arrange for formal statements from all personnel willing to come forward. Agents Martinez and Thompson will coordinate with you. Major Daniels, I need complete personnel files for every supervisor in Sergeant Mercer's chain." As the office cleared, Amara turned her attention back to the security assessment on her desk. Through the window, she could see Mercer still waiting outside, unaware that his world was about to change fundamentally. "Send in Sergeant Mercer," she told her assistant. When Mercer entered, his expression registered momentary surprise at finding Amara alone. He had clearly expected the typical cursory review his reports had received under Harrison. "Have a seat, Sergeant." "I prefer to stand, ma'am." "That wasn't a request. Sit down," Mercer complied stiffly. "Your security assessment is thorough," Amara began, watching his reaction carefully. "However, I have questions about certain recommendations, particularly regarding surveillance of the Eastern Barracks sector." "Those recommendations are based on security considerations, ma'am." "What specific incidents justify increased surveillance of that particular sector?" Mercer shifted slightly. "It's preventative, ma'am, based on my experience and judgment." "Your experience," Amara repeated. "Sergeant Mercer, are you aware that personnel assigned to that sector are 78% minority compared to 22% in other barracks?" His expression remained impassive. "I don't consider race in my security assessments, ma'am." "Really?" "That's interesting because the data suggests otherwise. Disciplinary actions under your supervision show a clear pattern of racial disparity." For the first time, Mercer's composure slipped slightly. "Those numbers can be misleading without context." "I agree, context is crucial," Amara replied, leaning forward. "So let's add context. 12 service members have come forward with documented incidents of discriminatory treatment by you. The Inspector General's office is currently interviewing them. Colonel Reynolds has provided a statement regarding your comment yesterday about diversity promotions." The color drained from Mercer's face. "Ma'am, I'm not finished, Sergeant. Your file contains 3 buried EO complaints that Colonel Harrison failed to process properly. Those are now being reviewed by the IG." Amara closed the folder and met his gaze directly. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties pending investigation. You will surrender your access credentials and report to Captain Jenkins for processing." Mercer's face flushed with anger. "This is a witch hunt. I've served this base faithfully for 8 years." Colonel Harrison understood. "Colonel Harrison is no longer in command," Amara interrupted calmly. "And your definition of faithful service appears fundamentally flawed, Sergeant." As if on cue, 2 MPs appeared at the door. "These officers will escort you to surrender your credentials," Amara said. "This isn't the end of the process, Sergeant, it's the beginning. For the first time in years, Fort Brennan will address its institutional failures head-on." As Mercer was escorted out, Amara turned to the window, looking out over the base that was now her responsibility. The path ahead would be challenging but necessary. Fort Brennan wouldn't change overnight, but today marked the first step toward the kind of military institution that lived up to its ideals. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "How's day one as the boss going?" Amara smiled slightly as she typed her response, making necessary changes. "I'll tell you all about it tonight." By 1400 hours, Fort Brennan buzzed with rumors about Sergeant Mercer's removal from duty. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's decisive action had created two distinct reactions throughout the base: relief among those who had experienced Mercer's discrimination, and defensive solidarity among his allies in the leadership structure. In the Officers' Club, Major William Hargrove, a 20-year veteran with close ties to both Mercer and former Colonel Harrison, convened an informal gathering of like-minded officers. "This is a clear overreaction," Hargrove stated, keeping his voice low despite the relative privacy. "Amara Wilson has been in command less than 48 hours and she's already disrupting established protocols." Captain Thomas Reeves nodded in agreement. Mercer's methods may have been unorthodox, but his security record was impeccable. Harrison trusted him implicitly. "And now we have the IG crawling all over the base," added Lieutenant Jessica Barnes. "It's creating unnecessary disruption to operations." What they didn't notice was Lieutenant Chen sitting in the corner booth, seemingly absorbed in paperwork but acutely aware of their conversation. The cultural battle lines were being drawn exactly as Colonel Wilson had predicted. Meanwhile, in Conference Room A, Amara conducted a briefing with Colonel Reynolds and her newly formed assessment team. "The resistance is organizing faster than anticipated," she noted, reviewing the intelligence gathered from various sources. "Major Hargrove appears to be coordinating the opposition." Reynolds nodded grimly. "Hargrove and Harrison were academy classmates. He's likely acting as Harrison's proxy in this situation. Their strategy is predictable," Amara continued, bringing up a document on the wall screen. "Initial incident reports indicate 3 distinct countermeasures already in progress." She highlighted each point methodically. 1. Information control. Selective redaction of documentation related to previous incidents. 2. Witness intimidation. Junior personnel reporting pressure to reconsider their statements. 3. Narrative reshaping. Characterizing the investigation as politically motivated. Captain Jenkins entered with a tablet containing updated information. "Colonel, we've identified 17 incidents of selective documentation over the past 3 years. Personnel files for minority service members contain disciplinary notations that weren't entered into the central database, creating a paper trail visible only to select supervisors," Amara concluded. "Ensuring biased evaluation patterns could continue without triggering automated oversight systems." "There's more," Jenkins continued. 3 witnesses have withdrawn their statements in the past hour, citing misunderstandings about the incidents they reported." Amara's expression remained composed, but her eyes hardened. "Coordinate with the IG team. All witness interviews will now be conducted off-base to mitigate intimidation factors." As the meeting continued, Amara's phone buzzed with a priority message from the base communications officer. "Urgent, unauthorized access to your personnel file detected. Security protocol initiated." "They're moving faster than expected," Amara murmured. Colonel Reynolds looked concerned. "What's happening?" "Someone accessed my personnel file without authorization. They're looking for vulnerabilities, deployment gaps, performance evaluations, anything they can use to undermine my authority or credibility." The door opened and Lieutenant Chen entered, slightly out of breath. "Colonel, you need to hear this. Major Hargrove is contacting division headquarters, claiming procedural irregularities in the command transition. He's requesting an emergency review." Amara received another notification on her tablet. "And now Sergeant Mercer has filed a formal complaint alleging discriminatory treatment and targeted harassment by me." The room fell silent as the coordinated counteroffensive became clear. "They're attempting to reframe the narrative," Reynolds observed, "positioning Mercer as the victim and you as the aggressor. A classic DARVO tactic," Amara replied calmly. "Deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. Predictable but potentially effective if we don't manage the information flow correctly." She stood and addressed her team with measured authority. This resistance was anticipated. "Implementation of Contingency Protocol Delta effective immediately." Captain Jenkins looked surprised. "You already had a contingency plan?" "5 of them, actually," Amara replied. "I've encountered similar resistance at 2 previous commands. The playbook is remarkably consistent." She brought up a new document on the screen displaying a detailed response strategy. "Copy. Contingency Protocol Delta." Objective: counter coordinated resistance to accountability measures. Phase 1: Documentation preservation. Deploy digital forensics team to secure all records. Implement immediate hold on file modifications. Create verification checksums for all personnel databases. Phase 2: Witness protection. Transfer key witnesses to temporary duties at Fort Bennett. Establish secure communication protocols for testimonials. Implement anti-retaliation monitoring system. Phase 3: Command authority reinforcement. Activate division-level oversight committee. Deploy prepositioned evidence of systematic discrimination. Initiate parallel investigation of command structure complicity. You've been planning this since before you arrived, Reynolds realized. My selection for this command wasn't random, Colonel, Amara replied. Fort Brennan's issues were identified in a cross-installation analysis conducted 6 months ago. I was specifically selected to address them. She distributed task assignments to each team member. We have a 4-hour window before their countermeasures fully deploy. Let's ensure our response is already in place. As the team dispersed to implement Protocol Delta, Amara received another notification, this one from an unexpected source. Major Hargrove was requesting a private meeting. The opposition leader wants to talk, she told Reynolds. That's interesting timing. It could be a trap, Reynolds cautioned. An attempt to get you to say something they can use against you. Almost certainly, Amara agreed. Which is why you'll be present as witness, and will record the entire conversation under military regulations for command disputes. 30 minutes later, Major Hargrove entered Amara's office, his posture rigid with barely contained hostility. His expression flickered briefly with annoyance at finding Colonel Reynolds already present. "Thank you for meeting with me, Colonel Wilson," Hargrove began, his tone professionally neutral despite the tension evident in his bearing. "I thought it might be beneficial to discuss recent events directly rather than through intermediaries." "I appreciate direct communication, Major," Amara replied calmly. To ensure transparency, Colonel Reynolds will be present, and in accordance with Regulation AR 620, this conversation will be recorded as it pertains to a potential command dispute. Do you understand and consent to these conditions? Hargrove hesitated, clearly not having anticipated this level of procedural thoroughness. That won't be necessary. This is merely an informal discussion. There's nothing informal about coordinating resistance to an official IG investigation, Major, Amara replied, her voice level but firm. Nor about accessing my personnel file without authorization or pressuring witnesses to withdraw their statements. The color drained slightly from Hargrove's face. Those are serious allegations, Colonel. They're not allegations, Major. They're documented facts. The question is whether you're here to offer an explanation or to continue the pattern. Hargrove's demeanor shifted, his expression hardening. Fort Brennan has operated effectively under established leadership protocols for years. Your aggressive changes threaten unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. Discrimination threatens unit cohesion, Major. Unequal treatment undermines operational effectiveness. These aren't matters of opinion, they're established military doctrine. Sergeant Mercer maintained exemplary security standards, Hargrove countered. His methods may have been demanding, but they were effective. Effective for whom? Amara asked quietly. The data shows clear disparities in how those demanding methods were applied based on race. That isn't leadership, it's prejudice in uniform. The standoff continued for several minutes, with Hargrove attempting various angles to justify the resistance while Amara methodically dismantled each argument with data and regulations. Finally, Hargrove shifted tactics. Colonel Harrison will not stand for this disruption to his command structure. Colonel Harrison is no longer in command here, Amara replied, and I've already spoken with General Mitchell at Division. He's fully briefed on the situation and has authorized my approach. The mention of division-level awareness clearly unsettled Hargrove. This isn't over, Colonel. On that point, we agree completely, Amara responded. This is just the beginning of necessary changes at Fort Brennan. The question you need to ask yourself is whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem that gets solved. As Hargrove left, Reynolds shook his head in disbelief. He actually thought he could intimidate you into backing down. People accustomed to privilege often mistake equality for oppression, Amara replied. Now we move to Phase 4. There's a Phase 4, it wasn't on the document. Amara smiled slightly. Some contingencies are best kept in reserve, Colonel. Phase 4 involves something Mercer and his allies never anticipated: transparency. She activated her communication system. Captain Jenkins, implement Operation Clear Light. It's time to bring everything into the open. At 0800 hours on day 4 of Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's command, Fort Brennan's main conference center was transformed into a formal military hearing chamber. The Inspector General had expedited proceedings based on the volume and severity of evidence discovered. Operation Clearlight, Amara's strategy of complete transparency, had brought every aspect of the base's discriminatory practices into full view. The hearing room was arranged with military precision. A central table for the three-person review panel, witness stations positioned for clear visibility, and documentation stations where evidence could be presented and recorded. Representatives from division headquarters occupied the first row of observer seating, their presence underscoring the seriousness of the proceedings. Captain Jenkins approached Amara as final preparations were completed. "All witnesses are ready, Colonel. The IG panel will begin in 20 minutes. And Sergeant Mercer, he's arrived with legal counsel. Major Hargrove is also present with 3 other senior NCOs from his faction." Amara nodded. "As expected, and our documentation. Complete and indexed according to your specifications. The evidence chain is unbroken." At precisely 8:30, the proceedings began. Agent Martinez opened with a formal statement outlining the scope of the investigation. "This hearing will examine evidence of systematic discrimination at Fort Brennan Military Base, specifically focusing on disciplinary disparities, promotion inequities, and the institutional mechanisms that enabled these practices to persist." Sergeant Mercer sat rigidly at the respondent's table, his attorney, a civilian specialist in military employment law, leaning close to whisper something in his ear. In the observer seats, Major Hargrove maintained a carefully neutral expression. The first phase of testimony established the statistical foundation. Captain Jenkins presented comprehensive data analysis showing the undeniable pattern of disparities. African American personnel were 3.2 times more likely to receive disciplinary actions than white counterparts for identical infractions. Hispanic personnel faced a 2.7 multiplier. These disparities increased to 4.1 and 3.8 respectively when Sergeant Mercer was the reporting officer. Mercer's attorney attempted to challenge the methodology. "Correlation doesn't establish causation. These statistics don't account for contextual factors in individual cases." "That's precisely why we conducted a full case review," Agent Thompson countered, bringing up the next evidence display. "We examined 237 disciplinary incidents over a 3-year period, controlling for all relevant variables including infraction type, prior record, and mitigating circumstances. The disparity remained consistent and statistically significant. As morning progressed, witnesses began providing direct testimony. Specialist Ramirez described how Mercer had conducted random inspections of minority personnel's quarters at 3 times the frequency of white service members. He would cite different regulations for different soldiers. White personnel would receive warnings for infractions that resulted in immediate disciplinary action for minorities. Lieutenant Chen testified about observational patterns. During training exercises, Sergeant Mercer would position himself to monitor minority personnel more closely. His performance evaluations consistently included harsher language for minorities, even when objective metrics showed equal or superior performance. By midday, the pattern had been firmly established through both statistical evidence and personal testimony. After a brief recess, the hearing entered its most critical phase, direct testimony from those who had experienced the most severe discrimination. Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, an African-American combat veteran with 3 deployments, approached the witness station. His posture was parade ground perfect, his uniform immaculate. "Staff Sergeant Johnson, please describe your interactions with Sergeant Mercer," Agent Martinez requested. "I arrived at Fort Brennan in June 2023 with commendations from my previous command. Within 2 weeks, Sergeant Mercer had cited me for 3 minor infractions that impacted my performance evaluation. When I attempted to address these through proper channels, I was informed by Major Hargrove that I should focus on improvement rather than complaints. Did you observe different treatment of white personnel with similar infractions?" "Yes, ma'am." "Private Cooper arrived late to formation the same day I did. I received a formal counseling statement. He received a verbal warning that wasn't documented." As Johnson continued his testimony, Mercer's expression darkened. His attorney scribbled notes frantically, occasionally whispering to his client. The testimony continued with mounting impact as 7 more service members provided similar accounts. Each narrative reinforced the others, creating an undeniable pattern of discriminatory treatment. At 1400 hours, the panel called Sergeant Mercer himself to testify. He approached the witness station with military bearing, though the strain showed in his tight jaw and rigid posture. Sergeant Mercer, do you wish to make an opening statement? The lead IG representative asked. Yes, sir. Mercer cleared his throat. I've served this country honorably for 23 years. My actions have always been guided by military regulations and the best interests of the service. I categorically deny any discriminatory intent in my duties. Sergeant Mercer, how do you explain the statistical disparities in your disciplinary reporting? Agent Thompson asked. Military discipline isn't about statistics, sir. Each case is unique. I've always applied regulations as circumstances warranted. Yet those circumstances consistently warranted harsher consequences for minority personnel, Thompson observed. How do you account for that consistency? Mercer shifted slightly. Some personnel require firmer guidance to maintain standards. And you determine which personnel required this firmer guidance based on what criteria, Sergeant? Performance indicators, attitude, adherence to proper military bearing. Let me be specific, Thompson continued, bringing up a documented case. Private Williams and Private Sullivan both failed to properly secure equipment following the same training exercise. Williams, who is African American, received a formal reprimand. Sullivan, who is white, received a verbal warning. Both had identical service records. What performance indicators justified this difference? For the first time, Mercer's composure faltered visibly. I would need to review the specific circumstances. We have, Thompson replied. There were no distinguishing circumstances noted in your own report. The questioning continued relentlessly, each example further undermining Mercer's denials. As evidence mounted, his explanations became increasingly contradictory. When shown documentation of his own comments regarding diversity promotions directed at Colonel Wilson, Mercer attempted to reframe the context. That was a private comment about broader military policy, not directed at Colonel Wilson specifically. Yet you made this comment immediately after an interaction with Colonel Wilson, while still on duty in uniform within earshot of junior personnel, Thompson countered. By late afternoon, Mercer's facade had cracked visibly. When confronted with the pattern of surveillance recommendations targeting minority housing areas, he finally abandoned the pretense. Those areas required additional security, he insisted, his voice rising slightly. The statistics support it. What statistics, Sergeant? Agent Martinez asked. We've reviewed all security incident reports. There's no statistical difference in reported incidents between housing sectors. Not all incidents get reported, Mercer replied, his frustration evident. Some groups are simply more prone to problems. That's reality, not discrimination. A murmur ran through the room at this naked admission of prejudice. In the observer section, Major Hargrove closed his eyes briefly, recognizing the fatal slip. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, made a single notation on her tablet. The final phase of the hearing addressed institutional responsibility. Colonel Reynolds testified about the command climate under Harrison. Complaints were systematically discouraged. Personnel who raised concerns were labeled troublemakers and often received unfavorable assignments or evaluations. And did Colonel Harrison actively participate in this suppression? Thompson asked. He established the policies that enabled it, Reynolds replied carefully. Whether through direct action or willful ignorance, the effect was the same. At 17:30 hours, Major Hargrove was called to testify about his role in perpetuating the discriminatory system. Major, records indicate you intervened in at least 14 EO complaints against Sergeant Mercer over 3 years. In 12 of those cases, the complaints were classified as resolved without action. Can you explain this pattern? Hargrove's response revealed the calculated nature of the system. Colonel Harrison emphasized handling matters at the lowest level possible. We considered these personality conflicts rather than systemic issues. Despite the statistical evidence suggesting otherwise, statistics can be interpreted various ways, Hargrove replied stiffly. And your recent attempts to access Colonel Wilson's personnel file, your calls to division headquarters alleging irregularities in the command transition, how do those actions align with proper military procedure? For the first time, Hargrove appeared genuinely uncomfortable. I had concerns about procedural adherence. Concerns that arose only after Colonel Wilson began investigating discriminatory practices, Thompson noted. By 1900 hours, the picture was complete. The panel adjourned to consider its findings and recommendations, leaving the participants to disperse in subdued silence. As Amara gathered her materials, she noticed Sergeant Johnson approaching hesitantly. Colonel Wilson, may I speak with you briefly? Of course, Sergeant. Johnson stood at attention. Thank you, ma'am. For 23 years in uniform, I've experienced what happened here. This is the first time I've seen it addressed directly instead of being buried or dismissed. Amara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The Army can't fulfill its mission without addressing these failures, Sergeant. Every soldier deserves equal treatment and opportunity. It's not just a moral imperative, it's a strategic necessity. Some will resist the changes, ma'am. Let them. Amara replied calmly. Resistance to equality reveals exactly why equality is necessary. As Johnson departed, Amara remained momentarily alone in the hearing room. Tomorrow would bring the panel's decision and the beginning of Fort Brennan's transformation. The path forward would require vigilance and determination, but today had established an irrefutable foundation. The truth, exposed to light, could no longer be denied. At 0900 hours on the fifth day of Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's command, the Inspector General panel delivered its findings. The central conference room was filled to capacity, with personnel from all ranks assembled to witness the culmination of the investigation. Agent Martinez presented the official conclusions with military precision. After thorough review of all evidence and testimony, this panel finds substantial confirmation of systematic discriminatory practices at Fort Brennan. Sergeant James Mercer is found in violation of military equal opportunity regulations, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and Department of Defense anti-discrimination policies. The room remained silent as Martinez continued. Sergeant Mercer is hereby reduced in rank to corporal and will be reassigned to Fort Irwin, California, with mandatory completion of comprehensive equal opportunity training before resuming any supervisory duties. Martinez turned to address the institutional findings. Furthermore, the panel recognizes that individual actions occurred within a permissive command environment. Major William Hargrove is hereby officially reprimanded and will be reassigned to administrative duties pending further review. All personnel files affected by discriminatory evaluations will be subject to corrective review. When the formal proceedings concluded, Amara called an all-hands meeting on the parade ground. Standing before the assembled personnel of Fort Brennan, she addressed them with calm authority. Today marks a necessary correction, not a conclusion, she began. The Army's strength lies in its diversity, different perspectives united by shared values and purpose. Discrimination undermines our cohesion and compromises our mission effectiveness. She gestured to a group of senior NCOs and officers standing nearby. Effective immediately, Fort Brennan will implement the Equal Opportunity Action Plan developed by this task force. Every service member deserves fair treatment, objective evaluation, and equal opportunity to serve according to their abilities. The plan's key provisions appeared on large screens. 1. Mandatory blind review for all personnel evaluations. 2. Automated statistical monitoring of disciplinary actions. 3. Anonymous reporting system with protected follow-up. 4. Revised promotion board procedures to eliminate bias. 5. Installation-wide climate assessment every 90 days. As Amara concluded her address, she noticed Staff Sergeant Johnson standing at attention in the front row, his expression reflecting cautious optimism. Beside him, other service members who had testified showed similar measured hope, not naive expectation, but the tentative belief that genuine change might be possible. 3 months later, Amara sat in her office reviewing the first quarterly assessment since implementing the reforms. Colonel Reynolds entered with the final report. "The numbers are promising, Colonel," he said, placing the document on her desk. "Disciplinary disparities are down 78%, promotion recommendations show statistical parity across demographic groups, and transfer requests have decreased by 62%. Good progress," Amara acknowledged. "But cultural change requires sustained effort. What's the feedback from the anonymous system?" "Mostly positive. Some resistance remains, but it's becoming increasingly marginalized as personnel see the benefits of fair treatment." A knock at the door introduced Major Elena Vasquez, Mercer's replacement as security supervisor. "The security metrics you requested, Colonel," Vasquez said, handing over a tablet. "Interesting finding. Incident reports from all barracks sectors show nearly identical patterns now that reporting protocols have been standardized." Amara smiled slightly. "Exactly as expected. When you remove bias from the system, the data reflects reality rather than prejudice." Later that evening, Amara video called her daughter Maya. "How's the reformation going, Mom?" Maya asked with a knowing smile. "Steady progress," Amara replied. "The system doesn't change overnight, but we've established new foundations. Some of the junior officers who witnessed the process are already implementing similar approaches in their units." "Creating a ripple effect," Maya observed. "Exactly. Real change happens gradually, then suddenly. Fort Brennan is just the beginning." After ending the call, Amara gazed out her office window at the base that had transformed significantly in just 3 months. The most important changes weren't visible in the physical landscape, but in the interactions between personnel, the fairness of evaluations, and the renewed sense of purpose that came from addressing long-standing injustice. Her phone buzzed with a message from General Mitchell at Division. Fort Brennan model being considered for Army-wide implementation. Briefing requested at Pentagon next month. Amara smiled. One base at a time, one policy at a time, one mind at a time, this was how institutions evolved. Not through grandiose declarations, but through persistent, principled leadership that demanded accountability and delivered justice. The work would continue tomorrow and the day after and for years to come. But today, Fort Brennan stood as proof that change was possible, necessary, and worth every ounce of effort required to achieve it.